Winter pressed itself against the lonely cabin at the edge of Red Creek Valley, breathing a slow, icy hush across the land. Snow drifted downward like pale feathers shaken loose from the sky, settling on the woodpile, where Clara Whitmore worked with quiet determination. Her gloves were thin, splitting at the seams, and each swing of her hatchet trembled slightly, not from weakness but from the weight of another year spent surviving more than living. At 22, she carried the stillness of someone who had learned to fold her grief into the rhythmic tasks of each morning. The valley had grown used to her silence. She had grown used to being unseen. The faint glow of dawn stretched itself across the frosted ground, casting long shadows from the cottonwoods near the stream. Clara paused to wipe the cold from her lashes. The air tasted of pine and memory, and the distant promise of snow yet to fall. Her breath rose like a fragile ghost, drifting upward and fading just as quickly. She wondered, as she often did, if this winter would be the same as the last, long, aching, and uneventful, her days marked only by the soft crackle of fire and the murmur of wind slipping beneath her door. The world had changed 2 years ago, when the mine swallowed her husband in one violent breath. The townsfolk mourned for a week, offered pies and wooden-voiced condolences, then carried on with their own burdens. Clara carried her loss alone. She stitched clothes for ranch families, sold broth and herbs when the weather allowed, and kept company only with the low hum of the valley. The ache had softened over time, but it had not vanished. Grief never truly did. It merely learned to step quietly. She stacked the final log, brushing snow from her shoulders as she stepped back, and that was when she saw them. Footprints. Large ones, cut deep into the snow, leading from the tree line to the corner of her barn. Not fresh, perhaps a day old, but impossible to miss. Too big for Deputy Price, too wide for any ranch hand she knew, and spaced in a way that suggested a man who walked with confidence, not caution. Her heart folded inward for a breath. Strangers rarely came this far from town unless they needed something, or intended harm. She followed the prints with her eyes, not her feet, pulling her shawl tighter around her. The morning air shifted, carrying the distant rumble of hooves from the valley floor, but nothing moved near the barn. Only the wind. Only winter itself. Even so, she felt observed, as though the trees held a secret they had not yet decided to share. By the time she reached town for flour and kerosene, the storm clouds had thickened. Mrs. Hargreaves, the elderly storekeeper whose hands always smelled faintly of cinnamon, peered at Clara over gold-rimmed spectacles. "You look pale, child," she said gently, though Clara had grown accustomed to such remarks. Pale was the natural shade of grief in winter. Still, she forced a smile and paid for her things. Deputy Allen Price lingered nearby, leaning against a barrel with a grin he likely believed charming. "Be careful going back, Clara," he drawled. "Heard someone's been wandering those woods near your place. Big fella. Apache, maybe. The kind you don't want to meet alone." Clara's fingers tightened around her bundle. She disliked how quickly fear spread in this town, how easily people assigned danger to those who looked different. But the footprints returned to her mind, their size, their nearness. She thanked the deputy politely, and hurried out before he could offer to escort her. She'd learned long ago that kindness from the wrong men felt more like a rope than a favor. The snow thickened as she made her way home, muffling the sound of her boots. The valley seemed to hold its breath. She walked faster, sensing something close, a presence that brushed the edge of awareness. When she rounded the final bend toward her cabin, the feeling intensified. She stopped. A man stood near the cottonwoods, half-shadowed by branches heavy with snow. Tall, taller than any man she had ever seen. Shoulders broad beneath a worn buffalo hide cloak. His hair long, dark, tied loosely behind him. The wind tugged at a few loose strands, carrying them across a strong, quiet face. He didn't move. Didn't threaten. He only watched her with an expression she couldn't decipher, a calmness both unsettling and strangely protective. Clara's pulse stumbled. She held her flower close to her chest, lips parting with a breath she didn't mean to release. She should have been afraid, and part of her was, but another part recognized something in his stillness, a kind of honor or sorrow that mirrored her own. The trees around him bowed gently in the wind, and he seemed carved from the same quiet strength. Before she could speak, he inclined his head in a slow, respectful gesture. then stepped back into the trees, disappearing with a silence so complete it left her shaken. Only the imprint of his presence remained, stretching across her thoughts like a shadow that refused to fade. Inside her cabin, she set down her supplies with trembling hands. The room felt smaller now, as if his brief appearance had shifted its walls. She lit a lamp, more for courage than light, and stared at the frost gathering on the window. The world outside remained still, but she felt the shift in her bones. Someone had been near her home. Someone powerful. Someone who watched without cruelty. Night fell early. Clara sat beside the fire, stitching a torn shirt, though her mind refused to settle. Every crackle of the wood made her look toward the window. Every gust of wind scraped along the edges of her nerves. She replayed the image of the stranger in the cottonwoods. The breadth of him, the quiet in his gaze. She wondered if he meant danger, or something far more complicated. When she finally rose to bar the door, the moon slipped from behind a cloud, lighting her yard with a cold silver glow. And there, just beyond the fence, she saw it. Another set of footprints. Fresh. Leading toward her door before turning away again. The stranger had come closer this time. Close enough to knock. Close enough to speak. But he hadn't. And somehow, that frightened her more than if he had. Snow whispered across the valley floor the next morning, swirling in quiet spirals as Clara Whitmore made her way toward town with a basket hooked over her arm. The storm had softened overnight, but the cold lingered like a thought that refused to leave. She walked carefully, boots sinking into the powdery trail, her breath forming pale ribbons in the air. Sleep had not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the stranger at the cottonwoods, tall, still, carved from winter's silence. His footprints near her door had unsettled her more than any threat could. Fear came with intention. His presence carried something she couldn't yet name. The sky stretched wide and colorless as she followed the narrow road, the world holding its breath beneath a muted dawn. Her basket felt heavier than usual. Perhaps it was her thoughts. Perhaps it was the sense that the valley was no longer empty of stories. She pressed on, hoping routine might banish the memory of that quiet, watchful figure. But as she neared the bend that overlooked the frozen creek, she sensed it again. That gentle disturbance in the air, that subtle shift of the world around her, as though something unseen had stepped into her path. She stopped. Snowflakes caught in her lashes. The valley fell silent. Then he appeared. Not from the trees, not from the shadows, but from the path itself, as though he had been walking beside her the entire time, waiting for the right moment to be seen. He moved with unhurried certainty, each step measured, deliberate. Clara's heart climbed into her throat. The stranger walked like a storm, quiet at first glance, but carrying a force that hummed beneath the surface, waiting to break open. He came to stand a respectful distance from her, the wind tugging gently at his dark hair. A broad cloak of buffalo hide draped over his shoulders, dusted with snow. His eyes, deep and steady, held the quiet strength of someone who had walked through many winters and survived each one with unspoken resilience. Clara clutched her basket tighter, unsure if she should speak. He broke the silence with a voice warm enough to cut through the wind, the words slow and careful, as though he didn't want to startle her. "Wolves," he said softly, "have been circling the valley. They follow the scent of fear and hunger. You should not walk alone." Clara felt the air shift around them, a faint tremor running along her spine. She wanted to answer, to thank him, to ask why he had come near her home, yet her voice tangled in her throat. His presence held both reassurance and danger, not in threat, but in the way it stirred something long dormant inside her. She finally managed a quiet nod, though her heartbeat felt too loud beneath her shawl. He continued walking at her side, neither asking permission nor assuming familiarity. He simply matched her pace, each stride effortless despite the heavy snow. It should have unnerved her. Instead, she felt a strange calm settle in her chest, as if the valley itself trusted him more than it trusted the footsteps of ordinary men. The closer they drew to town, the more the world seemed to awaken. Smoke rose from chimneys, dogs barked in distant yards, and the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed across the frosted air. Yet Clara noticed the way people stared the moment they stepped onto the main road. Conversations quieted. Eyes followed them from behind steamed windows. A few mothers pulled their children closer. The weight of those looks pressed against her like a cold wall. Deputy Allen Price watched from the porch of the general store, his jaw tightening as the stranger passed. Clara kept her gaze forward, praying the deputy wouldn't approach, but he did, stepping into their path with a smile that failed to reach his eyes. "Morning, Clara," he drawled, ignoring the man beside her. "Didn't expect to see you out walking with company." The pause hung heavy in the air. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. She opened her mouth to explain, though she had no explanation that made sense, but the stranger's presence steadied her. He didn't speak, didn't bristle, didn't offer an apology for existing. His calmness was a shield in itself. Deputy Price leaned slightly closer to Clara, his voice dropping low. "You ought to be careful. Folks don't always take kindly to surprises." Clara met his eyes for the first time, something firm settling inside her. "I can take care of myself," she said, more confidently than she felt. The deputy blinked, surprised, then stepped aside reluctantly, though he continued watching them with narrowed suspicion. Inside the store, Mrs. Hargreaves pretended not to stare at the stranger while ringing up Clara's purchases, but her fingers fumbled over the coins. Once Clara stepped outside again, the stranger remained exactly where she had left him, still as winter, patient as stone. He walked her home without being asked. The valley felt different beside him, not smaller or safer, but deeper, as though the land carried stories it had never told her until now. Clara stole glances when she thought he wasn't looking. His face held lines carved not by age but by endurance. A faint scar traced the curve of his jaw. Snow settled briefly on his lashes before melting into the warmth of his gaze. She wondered who he was, where he had come from, why he had chosen her cabin to watch over. When they reached the fork in the trail, he stopped. Clara stopped, too, unsure why the sudden quiet between them felt heavier than any silence she'd known. He looked toward the ridge, scanning the treeline with a soldier's awareness. "Trouble follows the valley," he murmured. "Men who seek warmth they don't deserve." He turned his gaze back to her, steady and solemn. "Keep your doors locked. And your lantern lit." Before she could answer, he stepped away, his form disappearing into the gathering snow as seamlessly as breath fading into winter air. Clara exhaled, unaware she'd been holding her breath. She continued home slowly, her pulse fluttering, every sound amplified. When she reached her cabin, she paused on the threshold, the memory of his final words echoing in her mind. "Keep your lantern lit." She lifted her eyes toward the darkening ridge. There, just beyond the trees, a different set of tracks waited. Fresh, chaotic, scattered in a way that suggested not one man, but several. And beside them, the prints of horses standing far too close to her door. The valley was no longer quiet. And Clara realized the stranger hadn't been warning her about wolves at all. Snow thickened through the afternoon, swirling like restless spirits outside Clara Whitmore's cabin as she set a pot of broth on the stove. The wind pressed against the windows with long, aching sighs, rattling the glass as if the earth itself were trying to speak. She tried to focus on the quiet domestic rhythm, chopping carrots, stoking the fire, smoothing the creases in her apron, but the tracks she had seen near the ridge lingered in her mind. They were not the calm, measured steps of the stranger who walked beside her that morning. These had been chaotic, heavy, the kind made by men who took what they wanted without asking. The memory coiled inside her like a cold serpent, refusing to loosen. As dusk settled, the valley dimmed into a world of muted blues and grays. Clara lit her lantern, remembering the stranger's warning, though she wished she didn't place such weight on the words of a man she still barely understood. Yet she had felt truth in him, quiet, unshakable truth, and now the flame inside her lantern flickered with a new purpose, more shield than decoration. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch to gather the last of the firewood, before the storm locked her in completely. Footsteps crunched in the distance. Clara froze. The sky, heavy with snow, held no moon to guide her eyes. But she sensed movement beyond the fence, the shift of weight, the breath of horses, the whispered murmur of men who believed they were hidden by the night. Her pulse skittered. She reached for the lantern with trembling fingers, lifting it high as she strained to see through the swirling dark. A laugh echoed softly, sharp, careless, and far too close. Clara rushed back inside, bolting the door with shaking hands. The broth on the stove simmered unnoticed as she pulled the curtains tight. Shadows crawled across the walls, shaped by the flickering lantern light. She tried to steady her breathing, willing her heart to slow, but every sound outside seemed amplified. The shifting of hooves, the clicking of a rifle being checked, the muttered joke of a man who had no right to be anywhere near her home. She remembered what the deputy had said about strangers in the valley, and how Mrs. Hargreaves had spoken of missing livestock. But none of those warnings had carried the chill that now crawled down her spine. These men were not hungry drifters desperate for warmth. There was something uglier in the way they circled her land, like wolves testing the strength of a lone deer before the snowfall swallowed the tracks. A knock shattered the silence. Not hard, not demanding, worse. A gentle tap, as though the man outside pretended politeness only to mask the intention beneath. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, trying to quiet the pounding inside. She did not answer. The tapping came again, this time followed by a voice, smooth and falsely warm. "Evenin', miss. Cold night out here. Thought maybe you could spare shelter for a traveler." Her stomach twisted. She stepped back from the door until her shoulders touched the far wall. The stranger from the morning had warned her about wolves, and now she understood he hadn't meant the creatures that roamed on four legs. These were men who sensed vulnerability like smoke on the wind. Silence stretched long enough for her to hope they had reconsidered. But then another voice spoke, rougher, amused. "Maybe she ain't alone in there. Maybe she's waitin' on someone." Laughter rippled through the darkness. Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight with panic. She considered blowing out the lantern, hiding in the deeper shadows of the cabin, but the stranger's voice echoed through her memory. "Keep your lantern lit." She clung to that advice like a rope thrown across a frozen river. The men murmured among themselves, debating whether to break the door or circle around. Clara reached for the iron poker beside the fireplace, gripping it so tightly her knuckles ached. Her breath fogged in the cold air that seeped through the cracks. She prayed they would grow bored and leave, but prayers felt small against the weight of footsteps creeping toward her windows. Then came a sound that jolted every nerve awake. The low, unmistakable rumble of a horse approaching at speed, snow crunching beneath powerful hooves. The voices outside stuttered into silence. Clara dared to peek through the edge of the curtain, heart hammering. A massive silhouette emerged from the storm, tall atop a dark horse that cut through the snow like a shadow tearing open the night. The man dismounted with the silent efficiency of someone who had lived more years outdoors than in. Even before he stepped fully into the lantern's reach, Clara knew him. That unhurried strength. That quiet authority. The stranger who walked like a storm. Nathan Crow. He didn't look toward her window. His gaze was fixed entirely on the men who had been prowling her land. Snow clung to his hair and shoulders, but he stood straight, broad, unmoving, as though winter itself could not touch him. One of the trespassers cursed under his breath, recognizing something in Nathan's poise that promised more trouble than they bargained for. Nathan spoke, and his voice carried across the snow like low thunder. "Leave. Now." The shortest of the men scoffed, though the tremor in his stance betrayed uncertainty. "We ain't looking for trouble," he said. "Just a warm place to spend the night." Nathan took a single step forward, and the air around him seemed to shift. Clara felt it even from inside the cabin, a swirl of gravity, a warning wrapped in stillness. Nathan didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stared at the men with a calmness so absolute it became its own kind of threat. "Trouble follows those who seek what isn't theirs," he said quietly. "You will leave this valley before the storm deepens." For a moment, no one moved. The wind howled between them, carrying flakes that sparked in the lantern's glow. Then, with a muttered curse, the men mounted their horses and rode off into the dark, their shapes swallowed by the snow. Clara let out a shaking breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Nathan turned toward her cabin. He approached slowly, not like a rescuer demanding gratitude, but like a guardian ensuring the danger had truly passed. When he reached her porch, he didn't knock. He rested a hand lightly against the door, as if feeling her fear through the wood. Then, voice low enough to reach only her ears, he spoke words that made her blood still. "They weren't here for supplies, Clara. They were here for you. And winter has only just begun." Snow fell in a soft hush the next morning, layering the world in a fragile stillness that felt almost holy. Christmas Eve crept into the valley with a pale sunrise that cast long strokes of gold over Clara Whitmore's cabin, warming the frost-laced windows, though the air outside remained sharp as cut glass. She stood at the stove, hands trembling as she poured coffee into a tin cup, her thoughts circling the memory of the night before. The knock at her door. The voices outside. Nathan Crow stepping from the storm like some ancient protector summoned by danger itself. Her heart had not yet settled into its usual rhythm. It fluttered restlessly, as if it sensed the ground shifting beneath her quiet life. When the coffee was ready, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and opened the door before she could talk herself out of it. Cold wind reached for her skin, but she stepped forward, lifting the cup into the pale morning light. Nathan stood several yards away, leaning against the split-rail fence with the stillness of a watchman who had not slept. Snow dusted his hair and shoulders as though the night had claimed him, but could not touch the fire within him. He turned at her approach, and the faintest warmth flickered in his eyes, a warmth that surprised her more than the danger had. "You should come inside," she said softly, though her voice faltered under the weight of the moment. He hesitated, as if crossing the threshold of her home required more permission than entering a battlefield. But something in her gaze, fear, gratitude, an unspoken plea for comfort, softened the caution in his stance. He followed her to the porch, careful, deliberate, as though he'd been walking around invisible wounds for years. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Nathan removed his snow-covered cloak and set it near the fire, revealing the strength beneath his clothes. Not merely the physical shape of him, though that alone made the small room feel smaller, but the quiet power, the steadiness of someone who carried more history than most men survived. Clara offered him the cup, and when their fingers brushed, a warmth sparked that made her breath catch. He murmured his thanks, but she barely heard it. She was too aware of the way her pulse whispered against her throat like a trapped sparrow. They sat across from each other, firelight dancing between them. The glow softened the harsh angles of winter outside, casting shadows that swayed in gentle rhythms along the walls. For the first time since her husband's death, the cabin felt alive with possibility rather than memory. Nathan watched the flames and she watched him, drawn to the silence he carried. Not the silence of avoidance, but of a man who spoke sparingly because every word mattered. Clara broke the quiet first. "You knew they would come, didn't you?" Her voice trembled, not with fear now, but with the vulnerability of being truly seen. Nathan's gaze drifted toward the window as if he could still sense the wolves, those on two legs, lurking somewhere beyond the trees. "Men like that look for the lone and the unprotected," he said softly. "The snow brings hunger. Hunger brings cruelty." A shiver moved through her, though the fire was warm. She traced the edge of her cup, trying to ground herself. "Why help me?" she whispered. "Why stay?" Nathan's hands tightened slightly, as though her question touched the tender place beneath the armor he wore. The storm outside deepened, wind brushing against the cabin with sighs that felt almost sorrowful. He looked at her then, not like one looks at a stranger, but like someone recognizing a truth he had been trying to ignore. "Because the valley watches you the way it watches its rivers and its morning light," he said. "Because you move through grief with more strength than most men carry in their bones. And because when I saw you walking alone I felt—" he paused, jaw tensing. "I felt something shift." The words settled around her like snowflakes melting on warm skin. Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight with feelings she had tried to bury since the day tragedy unraveled her life. She wanted to look away, to protect the frail shell she'd built around her heart, but his honesty held her in place. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, the room felt different, wider, deeper, filled with the possibility of something she hadn't dared imagine. The hours passed with slow grace. They shared stew near the fire, the quiet between them softening into a comfort that surprised them both. Nathan spoke of his family, gone now, scattered by sickness and war, and Clara listened with a tenderness she didn't know she still possessed. She told him about the mine collapse, the nights she had felt the world tilt beneath her feet, the mornings when she rose only because grief refused to let her rest. Their stories wove together like two threads pulled from separate cloths, forming something unexpected in the space between. Outside, the snowstorm thickened, wind humming against the cabin like a distant choir. Clara lit a single candle for Christmas Eve, its flame trembling yet steady. Nathan watched it with a contemplative look, as though the small light stirred memories buried deep within him. Clara leaned closer, drawn by the quiet intensity in his expression. "You don't have to stay out there tonight," she said gently. "The storm is too strong." But Nathan shook his head, rising to his feet with the grace of a man accustomed to moving through harsh worlds. "Your safety is in the watching," he replied. "A fire warms, but it cannot guard the door." She rose as well, her breath unsteady. "I'm afraid, Nathan." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, the strength beneath his calm exterior. His voice dropped to a low murmur, like distant thunder. "Fear keeps you alert. But you are not alone tonight. Not while I am here." Their eyes met, and the air grew still, charged with something neither of them dared name. Clara felt the moment settle deep within her bones, a moment that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. Before she could speak, Nathan moved toward the door, gathering his cloak. The storm roared when he opened it, snow swirling around him like a veil. Just before stepping out, he looked back at her, his gaze fierce and tender all at once. "If they return," he said quietly, "act like you're mine." Then he disappeared into the storm, leaving the door glowing with the echo of his words. Words that wrapped around Clara's heart and pulled it into a world she had never imagined stepping into again. Snow hammered the valley through the night, a ceaseless curtain of white that swallowed trees, fences, and every familiar shape. Clara Whitmore barely slept. Nathan's final words pulsed through her bones, "Act like you're mine," and she repeated them until they sank into a place she had not touched since her heart first broke. Before dawn, the storm quieted, settling into a heavy stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. She rose from her chair, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped to the window. The cabin's lantern still burned, a lone beacon against the pale morning. But what caught her breath was the sight just beyond the fence. Nathan, standing tall in the snow, cloak dusted white, eyes scanning the treeline with unwavering vigilance. He looked carved from winter and fire at once. Clara opened the door and stepped outside, her boots sinking into the fresh drifts. The cold stole her breath, but she walked toward him anyway, drawn by a force she no longer pretended she didn't feel. Nathan turned at the sound of her steps, his expression softening as she reached him. "You shouldn't be out here," he murmured. "Not yet. Danger still clings to the valley." She shook her head. "I couldn't wait inside, not after everything. Something has shifted. I can feel it." Nathan studied her for a moment, snowflakes clinging to his lashes like fragile stars. His voice dropped to a low rumble. "They will come again. Men like them don't accept being turned away. They saw your light last night. They smelled your fear. But what they didn't see was me choosing to stay." Clara felt her pulse stutter. Chosen. Such a simple word, but one she hadn't felt in years. She stepped closer, the space between them warming despite the wind. "Why?" she whispered. "Why choose me?" Nathan opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the distant crunch of hooves echoed through the silence. Clara's breath caught. Nathan's posture changed, coiled, ready, protective. He placed a hand on her arm, guiding her behind him as three riders emerged from the trees, their silhouettes dark against the snow-bright horizon. The leader tipped his hat, a mocking smile spreading across his face. "Morning, miss. Thought we'd finish our conversation from last night." Nathan stepped forward, blocking Clara from view. "You'll leave her land now," he said quietly. "Your kind has no place here." The man laughed, but there was a tremor beneath it. "We ain't afraid of you. This here's between us and the lady." Clara's fear rose like a tide, threatening to choke her. But then she remembered Nathan's instructions. If danger came, act like you're mine. She moved to his side, her hand slipping around his arm, fingers trembling but firm. Her voice rang clearer than she expected. "I'm not alone. And I don't belong to you." The riders exchanged looks, their confidence wavering. The leader spat into the snow. "So that's how it is. You think this Apache's gonna save you?" Nathan's jaw tightened, but he did not rise to the insult. Instead, he spoke with a calmness sharper than steel. I will protect what stands beside me. You ride away now, and this ends here. You stay, and winter will bury more than your tracks. The storm-dulled valley held its breath. Even the wind seemed to pause. Finally, the leader cursed under his breath, tugged his reins, and turned his horse away. The others followed, their silhouettes shrinking into the trees until they vanished altogether. Only when the last hoofbeat faded did Clara realize she'd been holding Nathan's arm with both hands. She released him with a shaky exhale. "You meant it," she whispered. "Protecting me. Standing with me." Nathan turned to her fully, and something unguarded flickered in his eyes, something deep and aching and long withheld. "Clara," he said softly, "I did not stay because of danger. I stayed because the moment I saw you on that road, something inside me recognized a home I'd forgotten how to want." Her breath caught. Nathan stepped closer, close enough that she felt the warmth of him even through the cold. "You walk through this world with quiet courage," he murmured. "You grieve without bitterness. You rise without applause. And somewhere in all my wandering, I realized I wanted to be near that kind of strength. Near you." Clara's eyes blurred. Nathan lifted a gloved hand, hesitated, then gently touched her cheek with a reverence that made her knees weaken. "If you tell me to leave, I will. But if you ask me to stay, I will give my life to your peace, to your future." Her heart broke open, not with pain but with the relief of something long denied. She placed her hand over his, letting warmth spill through her. "Stay," she whispered. "Not as my protector. As the man who makes the winter feel like hope." Nathan inhaled sharply, a sound of disbelief and gratitude braided together. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that felt like a vow spoken without words. The snow fell around them in soft, forgiving sheets, and for the first time in years, Clara felt the world shift toward light. Later that afternoon, inside the small log chapel in town, the minister lit 2 candles as Nathan and Clara stood before him. Word had traveled quickly, but the townsfolk came, not out of gossip, but out of recognition that something rare had taken root in the harshness of the valley. Clara's hands trembled in Nathan's, but he steadied her with a whisper only she could hear. "This is where I choose to begin again." When they exchanged vows, the storm outside quieted as if honoring the moment. And when Nathan lifted her veil and kissed her, it was not the claim of a savior, but the devotion of a man who had found the one person capable of softening a lifetime of wandering. That night, returning to her cabin as husband and wife, Clara paused at the threshold. The lantern still burned, just as he'd told her to keep it. But now, for the first time, she understood why. "Light," Nathan murmured behind her, "is for guiding what you want to come home." And she knew, with breathtaking certainty, that neither of them would ever walk through winter alone again.